So moving on to our example of a cumulative frequency distribution. I'm going to once again rewrite the number of arrests example. The frequency here. And then I'm going to put percent over here, which you'll see why in a second. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4 arrests, with 4 people having 0 arrests, 3 people having 1 arrest, 2 people having 2 arrests, 1 person having 3 arrests, and 2 people having 4 arrests. Again, with a total of 12 people in the sample overall. I'm also going to write the percentages that we calculated in the last part of this example. So 33% of the sample had 0 arrests, 25% of the sample had 1 arrest, 17% of the sample had 2 arrests, 8% of the sample had 3 arrests, and 17% of the sample had 4 arrests, for a total of 100% of people just being in the sample. All right, and so for the cumulative frequency distribution, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be coming up with numbers that correspond to the number of people in the sample, so the number of observations we have at or less than a certain value. So for example, we'll be able to have a single number that tells us, what number of people in the sample had 2 or fewer arrests. Or doing our relative frequencies here, what percentage of the sample had 2 or fewer arrests. So I'll start here with just the cumulative frequency. And so our first value here is going to be, what number of people in the sample have 0 or fewer arrests? Well, you can't have any fewer than 0, so our first number here is just going to be 4. And in general, when making a cumulative frequency, your first value is always going to be the same as your first frequency, because you can't have any less than whatever that first frequency is, because you're writing it in order, from least to most. Our next cumulative frequency, so the cumulative frequency for 1 arrest, is going to tell us the number of people in our sample who have 1 or fewer arrests. So for 1 or fewer arrests, we're looking at the total number of people who have either 1 or 0 arrests. And in order to find the cumulative frequency, you're going to do something that I call diagonal addition. So you're going to take your cumulative frequency, and you're going to add the number that is 1 across and 1 below, if you think about this as like a table. So here we're going to be adding this frequency of 3 for 1 to our first cumulative frequency. So 3 plus 4 comes out to 7. So our cumulative frequency for 1 arrest is 7. This means that 7 people in our sample had 1 or fewer arrests. And this is one that you can check pretty easily by just looking at the frequencies for 0 and 1 arrests. So 3 plus 4 is 7, and you can see that 7 people had 0 or 1 arrests. Our next cumulative frequency we're going to find using the same diagonal addition. So we're going to take our cumulative frequency, and we're going to add the number that is, 1 jump to the left and 1 below. So we're going to add the cumulative frequency for 2. We're going to add the frequency for 2 to our cumulative frequency for 7. Here, 7 plus 2 is 9, and this gives us a cumulative frequency for 2 arrests. How we interpret this is that 9 people in our sample had 2 or fewer arrests. In other words, 9 people in our sample had 2 arrests, 1 arrest, or 0 arrests. So that's 2 or fewer. And again, you can double check this by adding up the numbers that we have for 2, 1, and 0. So 2 plus 3 is 5, 5 plus 4 is 9, and that gives us 9 people who had 2 or fewer arrests. We're going to keep going and doing this diagonal addition, so we're going to add this 1 now, so 9 plus 1 is 10, and that gives us a cumulative frequency of 10 for 3 arrests. So 10 people in the sample had 3 or fewer arrests. And again, you could double check that by adding up the values that you have for 3, 2, 1, and 0 arrests. Finally, we're going to do one last bit of diagonal addition to get a cumulative frequency of 12 for 4 arrests. So this means that 12 people in our sample have 4 or fewer arrests. And this should make sense because we know that nobody has more than 4 arrests, and there are 12 people in the sample, so everybody in our sample has 4 or fewer arrests. So another good way to double check that your cumulative frequencies are correct is that your last cumulative frequency, so the cumulative frequency that you have for your highest value, should be the same as your n, or your total. So again, to double check your cumulative frequencies, you want your first cumulative frequency to be the same as your first frequency, and you want your last cumulative frequency to be the same as your total. We can also find the cumulative percent. And the cumulative percent gives you the percent of observations in your sample that are at a certain value or less. So it's a similar interpretation to the cumulative frequency. The only difference now is that we're looking at percent instead of these raw frequencies here. So our first cumulative percent would tell us what percent of our sample had 0 or fewer arrests. Well, again, you can't have fewer than 0 arrests, so we're going to just move this 33 over here and say that that's our cumulative frequency. So we'd say 33% of the sample had 0 or fewer arrests. To find cumulative percent, you do the same diagonal addition to fill up this column here. So to find a cumulative frequency for 1 arrest, we're going to do this diagonal addition. We're going to add our 33% here to our 25% here. This gives us a value of 58 if you add 33 plus 25. How we interpret this is that we have a cumulative frequency of 58% for 1 arrest. In other words, 58% of our sample are arrested 1 time or less. So in other words, 58% of the sample has either 0 or 1 arrests. So 1 arrest or less than that. And you could double check that by adding these two relative frequencies to each other. We can keep going down to fill this up. So to find a cumulative percent for 2 arrests, we're going to add our 58 to 17 here. And this gives us 75 as a cumulative percent. The interpretation for this is going to be that 75% of people in our sample has 2 or fewer arrests. So again, 75% of the sample has been arrested 2 times or less, so 2, 1, or 0 times. And you could double check that by adding up the percentages for 0, 1, and 2 as well. They'll all come out to 75. All right, so moving on down the line, we got 8 as our next value here, so we're going to add 75 plus 8 to get our next cumulative frequency. And 75 plus 8 comes out to 83. So we have a cumulative percent of 83 for a value of 3 arrests, and this means that 83% of our sample has been arrested 3 times or less. Finally, last but not least, we're going to add 83 and 17 here, and this comes out to 100%. So in other words, 100% of people in the sample have 4 arrests or less. And so this is kind of the same logic as here, where you want your last value to be 100 because it includes 100% of your sample. Everybody in your sample has your highest value or less than that. So if you want to double check your cumulative percent, your first value, again, should be the same as your first value in the frequency column, and your last value should be 100, because your last value includes 100% of all the observations that you have. All right, and that's cumulative frequencies. So with that, we're going to hop back over into the PowerPoint and look at some other things.